If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything that you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell down on his knees before him, saying, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. Oh, come on up, Best Buddy. You got to be here by me. We got important things to do. Where was I? But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, pay what you owe. Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. Then his Lord summoned him and said to him, you wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you? And in anger, his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you don't forgive your brother or sister from the heart.
Last August, I had the privilege of taking the training for conflict transformation training that was offered at Central Seminary and taught by Sharon and Dan Buttry, who are longtime international missionary partners. So the training started out with Dan asking us to respond to 2 items. First, we were to complete this sentence, conflict is. How would you complete that sentence? Well, the answers that came out were conflict is bad. It's fire, it's battle, it's violence, it's unhealthy, it's not Christian, it's competition, it's miscommunication, it's revealing, it's opportunity. We were then asked to answer another question. How do you feel in the midst of conflict? How do you feel in the midst of conflict? Well, this group came up with a lot of words: anxious, rejected, sick, hopeless, aggressive, fractured, dishonored, threatened, afraid, silenced, all sorts of feelings we have when we are in a conflict. Although a few people came up with a slightly positive view of conflict and a few positive feelings, most expressed really negative thoughts and feelings. And I guess if we were to do that exercise here, I bet you it would be pretty similar. Probably most of us feel uncomfortable in conflict and view it as bad or maybe unhealthy. We may even think it's not really being Christian, such that when we encounter a conflict here at church, we feel something is really wrong. The reality is, however, that in every congregation, and in fact in every family and in every community, there is diversity and difference of perspective and opinion. And inevitably, we are going to experience misunderstandings and conflict and even wrongdoing that will need to be dealt with if these relationships are going to continue. This is simply part of human existence, and it is also part of congregational existence. Our scripture passage today from Matthew 18 is a very practical one that helps us to know how to approach situations where conflict or distance is occurring between people as a result of some kind of misunderstanding or offense or sin. But before we look at what Jesus teaches here, let's think for a few minutes about common ways that we may approach conflict. First, there is the turtle response to conflict, in which a person dislikes conflict so that it's avoided whenever possible. When confronted with a conflict, they withdraw, they pull back, they disengage, they hide, they keep a distance, trying to ignore it and trying not to have to address the issues that are involved. There's also the rhino response to conflict, in which a person who's feeling a lot of anger and feels like someone has offended them or stepped out of line charges the offender, confronting them in anger and trying to force them to change and do what they want. There's the indirect triangulation response to conflict. When upset and offended by someone, this person then goes to someone else and talks about it and gets that third person on their side, and they try to feel better and less anxious by airing their grievances with someone else, rather than the person that they're having conflict with. Now, these are all common experiences of how to deal with conflict, right? And they're kind of common in the church as well. And there's another one. There's the throwing insults at each other response to conflict. And this is being modeled every day within our society, especially where there are political differences on platforms like Twitter and other social media platforms. People send put-downs to humiliate another person with no effort to understand or to restore the relationship. Well, we could go on because there's other approaches, but these four are pretty common if you think about it. And what we notice about all four of them is that they don't help the relationship. They don't help the conflict get any better. Uncomfortable interactions may be avoided or angry feelings may be expressed, but there's no restoring the relationship and reconciliation. And so the conflicts just keep festering and growing. Jesus teaches us a different way that is healthy and helpful and spiritual, a way that works to transform the conflict so that relationships within the community are restored. Surely this is needed in every arena of our lives, in our congregation as well. And so let's look together at this teaching of Jesus. First of all, we are told to move toward the person with whom we are having conflict, to deal directly with that person in a one-on-one conversation with the goal of restoring the relationship. Our natural impulse is to keep a distance, perhaps, so we protect ourselves from being further hurt or don't have to deal with the issue. Or it's to go and talk to someone else about that person and the wrong that they've done. But these don't solve anything. Instead, we need to move toward the person that has offended us. But we do need to be careful about how we do that. And the words in the text point out the fault can be applied in a rather unhelpful way that is judgmental and harsh. If we literally go up to a person and point out their fault, you can imagine what kind of response we could get. Our natural response to feeling criticized is to be defensive and angry. So how do we go about doing this in a way that helps the relationship that's already strained rather than hurts it? First of all, I think we need to take some time within ourselves to get ready to approach another person in a constructive manner. If we're feeling angry or hurt or put down, we need to think about what is it inside us that is causing us to respond in this way. We need to keep squarely in mind that the purpose of talking to this person is to regain a brother or sister, not just let off steam or try to change them. If we can be thoughtful and calm and concerned about that other person and listen to them, it is going to go much better. Paul John Lederach, who's well known in the field of peacemaking, says we need what he calls the spiritual disciplines of reconciliation, which are prayerful vulnerability, responsible discernment, and interactive engagement. Prayerfully and vulnerably, we need to look within ourselves to understand our feelings so that we can be honest about ourselves, but also willing and open to listen and try to understand the other person. We need to responsibly discern when it is important to address a problem that we have with another person. There are many small things in life that we simply need to accept in others so that we don't sweat the small stuff. But if something continues to cause distance and distrust in a relationship, we need to consider how to repair it. The discipline of interactive engagement reminds us that when we do go to talk to that person, it is as much to try to understand them and hear from them as it is to share what is distressing us. The principles of nonviolent communication can perhaps guide us a little bit at this point. This approach encourages us to start such a conversation with an observation of what we saw or heard or experienced that's troubling us, something that is kind of like a fact without a judgment attached to it. It moves on to share the feelings that this situation aroused in us and the needs that were hurt because of what happened. And then it moves on to a request that is something like, will you share with me? Will you help me understand? So there's no interpretations, no judgments when we're sharing the observation. There's no blaming, there's no accusations. There's a sharing of our experience, feelings, and needs, and a request for help to understand further. As you can see, this involves transparency, vulnerability, and openness to others, and a desire to build bridges. Now, sometimes, despite our best efforts, a one-on-one conversation doesn't work. It doesn't make things better. If that happens, Jesus says, take one or two others with you. Now, the purpose of this is not to gang up on that other person by bringing along others who agree with you. Rather, it is to create a relational environment that is more respectful and safe and seriously focused on resolving the problem. By having respected persons there with you who can both witness what is said and clarify it, but also have wisdom to offer on how to move forward with the conflict and provide some kind of accountability. So when a couple goes to marriage counseling for help in dealing with their fighting, they are demonstrating the wisdom of this, of having another person there to help them. If still the offender doesn't listen so that the conflict remains, and if that offense is so serious that it's causing disruption within the faith community, then the text says to bring it to the church. Now, we need to remember that when this was written, most churches were house churches. So maybe today we could think of it more like saying, bring it to your Bible study group that you attend with this other person, and have them help you, draw on their wisdom to try to figure out how to resolve the problem. It does recognize that sometimes a conflict that starts out between two people starts to snowball and starts to embroil many others in the church so that it can actually start to involve the whole congregation. And then what's required is developing a process whereby the larger body is involved in dealing with it. Finally, Jesus says, if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. At times in church history, these words have been used as justification for excommunicating people, throwing them out of the church. But Lederach encourages us to ask instead, how did Jesus treat Gentiles and tax collectors? How did he treat those oppressive Roman Gentiles and those greedy, collaborating tax collectors that he encountered? He didn't just discard them as being beyond hope. He talked with them. He responded to their needs. He ate with them. He remained open to a relationship with them. When even our best efforts to constructively deal with conflict with someone are unsuccessful and reconciliation does not result, we are to remain open to that person and the possibility that things could get better. I am reminded of and challenged by a TED Talk I heard recently by Özlem Cekic, I think is how you say her name, the first Muslim woman to win a seat in the Danish parliament. And she served from 2007 to 2015. Immediately upon winning, her email box was filled with hate mail, full of derogatory and abusive comments and threats. And this continued day after day after day. At first, she just deleted them all, wanting nothing to do with these people, assuming there was nothing she had in common with them. But as time went on, a colleague encouraged her to reach out to them instead and to talk with them and have a cup of coffee. Well, she thought about that for a while and finally decided to take his advice and chose as her first person the man who had sent her the most hate mail, someone who she describes as a Nazi. After asking his wife, he agreed to meet, and much to her surprise, they talked for about 2.5 hours. And they found really quite a number of things and experiences in common, and to her surprise, there were even a few things that she liked about him. Since then, she has had hundreds of what she calls dialogue coffee meetings with those who would be to her tax collectors and Gentiles. She always meets them at their houses to express her trust in them, and she brings along food to go with the coffee because she says if we eat together, we can more easily find out what we have in common and make peace together. This work of reconciliation is incredibly important. Whether it is one-on-one conversations with someone in our church or continuing to reach out to those who are our tax collectors and Gentiles. And that's the point of verses 18 through 20. When we're engaged in bringing about reconciliation between people on earth, we are engaged in the heavenly work of God, and the presence of Christ is with us. Peter's words highlight what is required for us in order to be able to deal with others in this way. When we approach others whom we feel have sinned against us, we need to do so with a willingness to forgive. The offering and the accepting of forgiveness is what can restore the relationship. But Peter immediately sees a problem here. It's hard to forgive. And it's even hard to forgive someone more than once. But in the nitty-gritty of life in congregations and families, there's many times when we're bumping into each other and offending and hurting each other. And that means forgiving over and over and over again. Is forgiving someone 7 times enough asked Peter, feeling rather generous. No, said Jesus. You need to forgive without limit, 77 times, or in other translations have it 70 times 7. And then Jesus tells this familiar but rather disturbing parable about a king who found out that one of his officials owed him an exorbitant amount of money, 10,000 talents. A talent being about 15 years of a laborer's wages. This was an astronomical amount, millions, perhaps billions of dollars, a debt there was absolutely no way that he could repay. He falls on his knees and begs for mercy from the king, and the king forgives him. But then that official goes and finds someone who owes him 100 denarii, or about 3 months of a laborer's wages. A significant amount, but one that could be paid back with time in only 1/600,000th of what he had just been forgiven. And when this other person begged for mercy, the official refused. He would not forgive him his debt, and he threw him into debtor's prison. When told about this, the king is greatly disturbed by the official's lack of mercy and returns to him his obligation to repay his unpayable debt. The overall point of this story is clear. As people who have experienced the unmerited and extravagant mercy and forgiveness of God, we too need to be willing to forgive one another. And if we do not forgive, we do suffer. We remain embroiled in our anger and in our resentment and in our inability to fully experience God's forgiveness. Being realistic and humble about our own shortcomings and remembering how much we have been forgiven by God can open our hearts to be merciful and compassionate to others. Henry Nouwen writes in his book, Bread for the Journey, community is not possible without the willingness to forgive one another 77 times. Forgiveness is the cement of community life. Forgiveness holds us together through good times and bad times, and it allows us to grow in mutual love. He continues, to forgive another person from the heart is an act of liberation. We set that person free from the negative bonds that exist between us. But there is more. We also free ourselves from the burden of being the offended one. As long as we do not forgive those who have wounded us, we carry them with us, or worse, pull them as a heavy load. The great temptation is to cling to our anger toward our enemies and then define ourselves as being offended and wounded by them. Forgiveness, therefore, liberates not only the other, but also ourselves. It is the way to the freedom of the children of God. I invite you this morning as we start the Lenten season to step more fully into following Jesus' way of reconciliation and forgiveness in all arenas of your life. Within our congregation, yes, but also at home, at work, and in the larger society. Doing so liberates us to experience more fully God's grace and mercy, and even the very presence of Christ working among us to bring about reconciliation. May this be so. Amen.